Dorothy Bockerman, and I'm going to tell you about my great-grandmother. The name of this story is Grandma Nelson. Now, storytellers are always looking different places to find stories, and this story comes to me from my family. When I was very small, I heard lots of my relatives and neighbors and friends talk about somebody named Grandma Nelson. I didn't know who she was. I'd never met her. And when I got older, I discovered she'd actually died years before I was born. And people were still talking about Grandma Nelson. Her story started in the late 1880s or maybe the early 1890s, when her mother in Sweden sent her to live with her father, who settled in Howard County, Nebraska. I'm not too sure why she was sent over here. She was already a teenager. And her father evidently didn't want her to live with him because he went around and found somebody to marry her. But he couldn't find any Swedish guys, so he found a Danish guy. And that's how she went from being Marie Sundström to being Marie Nelson. And she went and lived with her husband, who ran a store in Dannebrog, Nebraska. This Swedish girl living with a Danish man. She was a teenager, and he was in his 30s already. Well, you can imagine what her life was like. Well, they must have had some kind of communication and some language together, because by the time they finished having children, she'd had about 13 of them. And they all lived. Oh, one of them died when he was a teenager, but that's not part of this story. That's a different story. And while she was living over the store, she evidently didn't like that very much, and she got her husband to buy her a farm on the Loup River, as a matter of fact, and she moved with her children out to the farm. Her husband continued to work in the store, but she ran the farm. Eventually, he sold the store and moved out on the farm, but Marie, my great-grandma Marie, was the boss of that farm. She was in charge. Well, part of the story was the reason her life was so difficult was because when she came and they got married, a couple of months later, she actually had a baby that couldn't possibly have belonged to her husband. But that's another story that a lot of people in my family talk about. But her husband, Hans Nelson, treated that child as his own. We got to the up to the 1917 or 1916 World War I. All of her children, who would have been the right age to go be soldiers, were all girls, so they didn't get drafted. But when the soldiers came back, they brought a virus with them. And many people in the whole United States and in many countries all around the world came down with this horrible flu. In our part of the country, it was called the Spanish influenza. There was a neighbor of Marie's that they woke up one morning, mother, father, child, baby maybe, no more than a toddler, who before the night fell had all three died. Seemingly healthy at the beginning of the day, dead by the end of the day. And when Marie heard that this had happened to her neighbors, well, she had 13 kids, she organized all of her boys, 6 or 7 of them, into teams and sent them to the neighbors' farms to see if there was any need for them to have the livestock taken care of. They first went to their neighbor, who she knew they had all died, and had them feed the cattle and feed the chickens and gather the eggs. And she had her sons go to all these farms and take care of the livestock and make sure that they were fed and taken care of. Now, cows need to be milked or they will get sick too. So they would do all of those things. And she told her sons that they were not to go in anybody's house, that they should contact anybody in the house and find out if there was anybody there who was sick. And if they were, one of her sons was supposed to go tell the doctor that he should go and check on these people. About the same time, she learned that her own daughter, my grandmother, Sophie, had a 3-year-old son who had come down with the flu. And Marie, who had a number of teenage daughters living in the home, was had collected all of her other grandchildren who were not sick. They stayed with their aunts. And she went and stayed with Sophie and her family, picked up, who was the guy who would eventually become my Uncle Earl, and held him for almost a month. She didn't put him down, and he lived. She was always granted saint-like status in our family after that. And when I was a teenager once, you can imagine she'd been dead for 20 or maybe 30 years by this time, I heard somebody from Dannebrog, I don't even know who it was, say something negative about my Grandma Nelson. Great-grandma, really, to me. And somebody else, again, from Dannebrog, whom I do not know, rounded on her and thoroughly told her off that Mrs. Nelson had saved their farm, and there was nothing bad to say about that woman. And those are the things that I heard about my Grandma Nelson. I heard an argument between two of my aunts who both thought they were very good cooks, settled because one of them said, well, I used Grandma Nelson's recipe. So, maybe you have some stories in your family too. Listen to the things people say. Listen to the things your children say. Listen to the things your parents say. Listen to the things your brothers and sisters say. Maybe there's a story in there for you to tell others.